Ji-won's heart pounded against her ribs as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows of the maintenance alcove. The metal walls of Kepler-7 trading station vibrated with the constant hum of massive cargo ships docking and undocking. Through the grimy viewport beside her, she could see the swirling purple nebula that surrounded this remote outpost at the edge of known space. The air was thick with the smell of burning plasma fuel and unwashed bodies. Dozens of refugees from across the galaxy huddled in small groups along the corridor, their eyes hollow with hunger and fear. A blue-skinned Vortarian mother clutched her crying infant close to her chest, while an elderly Centaurian man sat motionless against the wall, his breathing shallow and labored. This was the reality of Kepler-7 that the Galactic Council never saw in their polished reports. The station served as a major trade hub, where merchant vessels from hundreds of worlds stopped to refuel and resupply. But it also attracted the desperate and displaced, those who had nowhere else to go after their homeworlds were ravaged by war, plague, or economic collapse. Ji-won adjusted the torn fabric of her disguise, making sure her diplomatic insignia remained hidden beneath the layers of dirty cloth. Her real uniform, with its crisp Terran blue fabric and gleaming rank pins, was carefully concealed in a hidden compartment. For 3 weeks now, she had lived among these forgotten souls, documenting the abuse and neglect that station authorities tried so hard to cover up. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor, causing every refugee to shrink back. Against the walls, Ji-won peered around the corner and felt her blood run cold. A massive Zephyrian enforcer was making his rounds, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming like polished obsidian under the harsh white lights. He stood nearly 8 feet tall with 4 powerful arms and mandibles that could easily crush a human skull. The Zephyrians were legendary throughout the galaxy for their warrior culture and complete lack of mercy. They served as enforcers and security personnel on dozens of stations and ships, feared by criminals and innocents alike. Their reputation for cruelty was matched only by their absolute loyalty to whoever paid their contracts. This particular enforcer wore the red and black uniform of station security, with weapons attached to each of his forearms. A plasma rifle hung across his broad back, while smaller sidearms and shock batons hung from his utility belt. His name tag, written in standard galactic script, read Hyunwoo Keth. As he approached, the refugees seemed to melt into the shadows. A young Terran boy, no more than 12 years old, accidentally dropped his water container. The metallic clang echoed through the silence like a gunshot. The boy froze in terror as the Zephyrian's glowing amber eyes fixed on him. Ji-won watched in fascination as something unexpected happened. Instead of the brutal response everyone expected, Hyunwoo Keth simply picked up the container and handed it back to the boy with surprising gentleness. The child stammered his thanks and quickly disappeared into the crowd. This was her chance. Ji-won had been waiting weeks for an opportunity to approach one of the station's enforcers directly. Her mission required her to gather evidence of how security personnel treated the refugee population. Every other enforcer she had observed lived up to their savage reputation, using shock batons and threats to keep the displaced population in line. But something about this Zephyrian seemed different. There had been no harsh words, no display of dominance, no casual cruelty that she had witnessed from his colleagues. Taking a deep breath, Ji-won forced her hands to shake as she stepped out of the shadows. She had to sell this performance perfectly. Her life and the lives of countless refugees throughout the galaxy might depend on the information she could gather. The corridor seemed to stretch forever as she walked toward the towering alien warrior. Other refugees pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Some whispered urgent warnings in a dozen different languages, begging her to turn back before it was too late. A merchant's cargo drone hummed overhead, its anti-gravity engines creating a low buzzing sound that seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Somewhere in the distance, the automated station announcement system crackled to life, announcing the arrival of another trading vessel from the Outer Rim territories. Ji-won's legs felt like liquid metal, threatening to give out with each step. She had faced down hostile alien diplomats in formal negotiations, survived 3 different assassination attempts, and once stared down a Chronosian war fleet without flinching. But this moment, pretending to be vulnerable while approaching a creature that could end her life with a single gesture, tested every limit of her courage. She stopped 3 feet away from Hyunwoo Keth, close enough to see her reflection in his polished exoskeleton. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, exactly as she had planned. "Excuse me," she said, extending one trembling hand palm up in the universal gesture of supplication. "Could you spare just 1 credit? I haven't eaten in 3 days." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. Time seemed to freeze as Hyunwoo Keth's massive form loomed over Ji-won. His 4 arms hung at his sides, each one thick as a human, torso and ending in clawed hands that could tear through steel plating. The amber glow of his compound eyes intensified as he studied her face, tilting his head in a way that reminded Ji-won of a predator examining prey. The other refugees held their breath. A Mantarian trader, his insect-like features twisted with fear, began slowly backing toward the nearest exit. The Vortarian mother pulled her child closer, whispering desperate prayers in her native tongue. Even the automated cleaning drones seemed to sense the tension, their usual humming reduced to barely audible whispers. Ji-won forced herself to remain perfectly still, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She had studied Zephyrian behavior patterns extensively during her diplomatic training. They respected strength and despised weakness. Showing fear would likely result in violence, but displaying too much confidence might be seen as a challenge to their authority. What happened next defied everything she thought she knew about the warrior species. Hyunwoo Keth reached slowly for the datapad attached to his utility belt. His movements were deliberate and careful, as if he was trying not to frighten her further. The device chirped softly as he activated it, the blue holographic display casting strange shadows across his dark exoskeleton. "Account number," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the metal floor beneath their feet. Ji-won blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your station account number," he repeated, this time speaking more slowly. His standard was heavily accented but clearer than many aliens she had encountered in her diplomatic career. "For credit transfer." With trembling fingers, Ji-won recited the numbers from her fake refugee identification. She watched in amazement as Hyunwoo Keth's clawed fingers moved across the holographic interface with surprising dexterity. The transfer confirmation appeared on screen, but instead of the single credit she had requested, the amount made her gasp. 50 credits, his entire daily meal allowance. "Wait," she whispered, staring at the glowing numbers. "This is too much. I only asked for 1 credit." But Hyunwoo Keth wasn't finished. He reached into a sealed compartment on his chest armor and pulled out a military-grade protein bar. The packaging was marked with Zephyrian script, but Ji-won recognized the shape. These were high-energy rations designed to sustain warriors during extended combat operations. 1 bar contained enough nutrients to keep a human alive for 2 days. He placed it gently in her palm, his massive claw careful not to scratch her skin. The warmth of the package told her it was fresh from his personal supplies, probably part of his own lunch. The corridor erupted in shocked whispers. A group of Centaurian refugees near the far wall began clicking their mandibles in rapid conversation. The sound reminded Ji-won of old Earth insects, but she knew they were discussing what they had just witnessed in tones of complete disbelief. An elderly Terran man, his face marked with the scars of some long-ago conflict, stepped forward from the crowd. "Impossible," he muttered, his eyes wide with wonder. "I fought against Zephyrians during the Rim Wars. They don't show mercy. They don't show kindness. They certainly don't give away their own food." A young aquiline female, her translucent skin, shimmering with bioluminescent patterns, began recording the scene with a small device hidden in her robes. Her gills fluttered rapidly with excitement as she whispered commentary in her native tongue. But the most dramatic reaction came from another group of refugees huddled near the maintenance shaft. 3 Corellian traders, their blue-gray skin marked with ritual tattoos, actually fell to their knees. In their culture, witnessing an act of impossible generosity was considered a sign of divine intervention. Hyunwoo Keth seemed uncomfortable with the attention. His amber eyes darted around the corridor, taking in the shocked faces and whispered conversations. For a moment, Ji-won thought she saw something almost human in his expression. Embarrassment, perhaps, or uncertainty. "Eat," he said again, his voice softer now. He gestured toward the protein bar in her hands. "Body needs fuel, like Starship. Needs plasma. Cannot function on empty." Ji-won's fingers closed around the bar, feeling its solid weight. The packaging was warm and smelled faintly of exotic spices. "Why?" she asked, looking up into his alien features. "Why are you helping me?" Hyunwoo Keth was quiet for a long moment, his secondary arms folded across his chest, while his primary hands remained at his sides. When he spoke, his words carried a weight that seemed to surprise even him. "Long ago, Terran ships saved my clutch brothers from dead space. Captain could have left us to drift. Instead, shared oxygen, shared food, shared hope." His mandibles clicked softly, a sound Ji-won recognized as thoughtfulness rather than aggression. Zephyrian. "Honor demands repayment of debt. But human kindness," he paused, searching for the right words. "Human kindness teaches different lesson." The crowd had grown larger now. Word was spreading through the refugee sections of the station that something unprecedented was happening. Aliens from dozens of species pressed closer, their various forms of sensory organs focused on the unlikely pair at the center of the corridor. A cargo transport rumbled past the observation windows, its massive bulk blocking out the stars for several seconds. The ship's running lights cast moving shadows across the walls, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere around the scene. "What lesson?" Ji-won asked softly. Hyunwoo Keth's eyes met hers again. "That strongest warriors protect weakest souls. Not because of debt, not because of orders, because it is right thing to do." The next few days passed like scenes from a dream Ji-won never expected to experience. Each morning, as the artificial sunrise systems gradually brightened the station corridors, she would find small gifts waiting in her makeshift sleeping area. A thermal blanket that kept her warm during the cold station nights. A water purification tablet that made the recycled station water actually taste clean. Medical patches for the cuts and bruises that came with living rough on the metal floors. At first, she thought other refugees were sharing their meager supplies, but then she noticed the pattern. Every gift bore tiny markings in Zephyrian script, so small they were almost invisible, unless you knew where to look. On the second day, she watched from the shadows as Hyunwoo Keth made his security rounds. What she saw changed everything she thought she knew about the massive warrior. Instead of the brutal enforcement tactics used by his colleagues, he moved through the refugee areas, like a gentle giant among broken children. When a group of Andromedian younglings got too close to a restricted maintenance shaft, instead of using his shock baton, he simply lifted them away from danger with surprising care. His forearms worked in perfect coordination, placing each child safely back with their families while making soft clicking sounds that seemed to calm their fears. The elderly cetacean refugee, her breathing apparatus malfunctioning and filling with fluid, collapsed near the food distribution center. Other security personnel would have called for a cleanup crew and moved on, but Hyunwoo Keth knelt beside her, his massive form somehow folding down to a less intimidating size. He activated his suit's emergency medical protocols and administered first aid until the station medics arrived. Most remarkable of all was what Ji-won witnessed during a confrontation between security forces and a group of desperate Corellian traders. 3 of Hyunwoo Keth's fellow enforcers had cornered the blue-skinned aliens, accusing them of stealing food rations. The situation was escalating quickly, with shock batons being drawn and the Corellians backed against a wall. Then Hyunwoo Keth arrived. "Brothers," he said to his fellow enforcers, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through countless battles. "These ones hungry, not criminal. Station provides rations for all who register properly." "They're not." "Registered," snarled one of the other Zephyrians, a smaller but more aggressive warrior whose scarred exoskeleton told stories of violent encounters. "Illegal presence means immediate deportation." "Then we help with registration," Hyunwoo Keth replied calmly, "is faster than paperwork for deportation." Within minutes, he had guided the Corellian family through the complex bureaucratic process, using his own security clearance to expedite their refugee status. The other enforcers, clearly uncomfortable with this approach but unwilling to challenge a veteran warrior, eventually moved on to other duties. By the third day, Ji-won realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. A Zephyrian warrior who had somehow learned to channel his people's legendary strength into protection rather than domination. Their third meeting happened in an observation lounge on the station's upper level, a place where refugees rarely ventured, because of the increased security presence. Ji-won had been following Hyunwoo Keth at a distance, trying to understand the full scope of his unusual activities, when he suddenly stopped and turned around. "How you follow well for diplomat," he said without preamble. But Zephyrian hearing detects heartbeat from 50 meters. Ji-won's carefully maintained refugee disguise suddenly felt paper-thin. She looked around the empty lounge, with its massive viewport showing the swirling colors of the surrounding nebula, and realized they were completely alone. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Hyunwoo Keth moved to the viewport and gazed out at the cosmic display beyond. A massive cargo hauler was approaching the station, its running lights creating slow patterns against the purple and gold clouds of stellar gas. First day you asked for 1 credit. Desperate refugee would ask for more. Second day you watched me help Cetacean Elder. Real refugee would be focused on own survival. Today you follow from level 7 to level 12 without stopping for rest or food. He turned to face her, his amber eyes reflecting the nebula's glow. Trained observer. Military bearing under refugee clothes. You study me like scientist studies new species. Ji-won felt her shoulders straighten despite her efforts to maintain her disguise. Years of diplomatic training made it difficult to completely hide her true nature when directly confronted. You're very perceptive. Zephyrian warriors survive by reading enemies and allies correctly, he replied. You are neither refugee nor enemy, so you must be ally with hidden purpose. She took a deep breath and made her decision. The mission was important, but so was the unprecedented opportunity to understand this remarkable being. I'm not really a refugee, she admitted, her voice stronger now. I'm Commander Park Ji-won, Terran Diplomatic Corps. I'm investigating refugee abuse on this station. Instead of anger or betrayal, Hyunwoo Keth's mandibles began clicking in a rhythmic pattern. After a moment, Ji-won realized he was laughing. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard, a deep rumbling punctuated by sharp clicks that somehow conveyed genuine amusement. And I learned from humans how to be better warrior, he said, his amber eyes bright with what looked suspiciously like pleasure, by protecting weak, not crushing them. Through the viewport, the approaching cargo ship began its docking sequence, automated systems guiding it toward the station's massive receiving bays. The sight reminded Ji-won of her own arrival weeks ago, when she had first begun this dangerous, undercover mission. How? She asked simply. Hyunwoo Keth was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the cosmic vista beyond the transparistile. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of deep memory. 3 cycles ago, Terran colony ship Harmony found my patrol craft drifting in dead space. Engine dead, life support failing, clutch brothers dying one by one. His secondary arms gestured toward the stars. Captain Minsu and crew could have claimed salvage rights, taken our weapons and armor, left us for void death. Instead, they shared air, shared food, shared hope. The massive cargo hauler completed its docking with a vibration that traveled through the station's superstructure. Ji-won felt it in her bones, a reminder of the vast engineering that kept this isolated outpost functioning in the hostile environment of space. Captain told stories during long journey to nearest starport, Hyunwoo Keth continued. Stories of human wars where enemies became friends. Stories of humans who died protecting strangers. Stories of species learning to be better through human. Example. He turned back to Ji-won, and she saw something in his alien features that transcended species boundaries. Purpose, determination, and something that might have been hope. So I learn. And I teach others through actions, not words. Maybe one day, Galaxy becomes a place where strength serves compassion instead of crushing it. The storm began brewing 3 days after Ji-won's revelation to Hyunwoo Keth. She was helping distribute water rations in Section C when the first warning signs appeared. Automated security drones, normally content to hover at ceiling level, began descending closer to the refugee areas. Their red scanning lights swept back and forth with increased frequency, recording everything. "Something wrong," whispered Kira, an elderly Nexarian refugee whose purple-tinged skin had turned pale with fear. Her species was known for their ability to sense emotional disturbances in others, and right now she looked terrified. Bad feelings everywhere, like storm coming to peaceful valley. Jiwon noticed it too. The usual pattern of security patrols had changed. Instead of the regular sweeps that refugees had learned to predict and avoid, enforcement teams were moving in seemingly random patterns throughout the station. More troubling, they were all carrying heavy weaponry instead of their standard crowd control equipment. That evening, as the station's artificial night cycle dimmed the corridor lighting, Jiwon made her way to the observation lounge where she and Hyunwoo Keth had taken to meeting. But when she arrived, she found only empty space and the distant glow of the nebula beyond the viewport. Hours passed. Then, as she was about to give up and return to her sleeping area, her communication device chirped with an encrypted message. The sender was listed as friend, but she recognized the careful phrasing that marked it as coming from Hyunwoo Keth. "Cannot meet tonight. Being watched. Stay safe, small diplomat." A chill ran down Jiwon's spine that had nothing to do with the station's recycled air. She had spent enough time in dangerous situations to recognize when the walls were closing. In the next morning brought confirmation of her worst fears. Station Security Chief Valdris, a cold-blooded reptarian whose species was known for their calculating cruelty, called an emergency assembly of all security personnel. Jiwon positioned herself near a maintenance shaft where she could observe, without being seen. Valdris stood on a raised platform in the security briefing room, his scaled hide gleaming under the harsh lights. Behind him, a massive holographic display showed surveillance footage from throughout the station. Jiwon's heart sank as she recognized scene after scene of Hyunwoo Keth helping refugees. "Fellow enforcers," Valdris began, his voice carrying the hiss that made his species so intimidating. "We have discovered a cancer within our ranks. One of our own has been compromised by human weakness." The assembled security forces, representing a dozen different warrior species, watched in silence as the footage played. There was Hyunwoo Keth, sharing his food rations. There he was helping register the Corellian family. There he was administering first aid to the injured cetacean elder. "Behold the corruption of our noble calling," Valdris continued, his reptilian eyes gleaming with malice. "A Zephyrian warrior reduced to nursemaid for galactic refuse. This contamination spreads like a virus, threatening the very foundation of order we maintain." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some seemed shocked by what they were seeing, while others appeared disgusted. A few of the younger enforcers looked confused, as if they couldn't understand why helping others was being presented as a crime. "The infected individual will be terminated immediately," Valdris declared. "Such weakness cannot be tolerated in the Enforcement Corps. It undermines our authority and encourages the dregs of the galaxy to believe they deserve better treatment than they receive." Jiwon's blood turned to ice as she watched tactical squads receiving their deployment orders. Heavy assault teams were being dispatched to the lower levels, where Hyunwoo Keth was stationed. These weren't arrest squads equipped with stun weapons and restraint devices. These were execution teams, carrying plasma rifles and explosive charges. She tried to activate her emergency communicator to warn him, but the device showed no signal. The security lockdown had activated jamming fields throughout the station, cutting off all unauthorized communications. Racing through maintenance shafts and service corridors she had mapped during her weeks undercover, Jiwon made her way toward the lower levels. Behind her, she could hear the heavy footsteps and mechanical whirring of enforcement drones moving into position. She reached level 15 just as the tactical squads were taking their positions. Through a grate in the ventilation system, she could see Hyunwoo Keth in the main corridor below. He was calmly helping a group of Vortarian children sort through a shipment of donated toys, his massive form somehow gentle as he interacted with beings barely knee-high to his lowest joint. The enforcement teams emerged from 3 different directions simultaneously, their weapons already powered up and targeting systems active. Red laser dots danced across Hyun-Woo Keth's exoskeleton as the squad leaders prepared to give the order to fire. Hyun-Woo Keth of Zephyr Prime, announced the lead enforcer, a heavily armed Chronosian whose species rivaled the Zephyrians for combat prowess. By order of Station Security Chief Valdris, you are condemned for contamination by human weakness. Prepare for immediate termination. The Vortarian children screamed and scattered as Hyun-Woo Keth slowly stood to his full height. Even surrounded and outgunned, he moved with the dignity of a true warrior. His forearms spread wide, showing that he carried no weapons. "I accept judgment," he said calmly, "but allow younglings to reach safety first." "Negative," the Chronosian replied. "Witnesses complicate cleanup procedures." That was when Ji-won realized the horrible truth. This wasn't just an execution. It was going to be a massacre, designed to eliminate anyone who might spread word of what Hyun-Woo Keth had been doing. She faced the impossible choice that every undercover operative dreads. Her mission was critical to the welfare of refugees throughout the galaxy. If she maintained her cover and escaped the station with her evidence, she could potentially reform policies that affected millions of displaced beings across known space. But breaking cover meant risking everything to save one remarkable individual and a handful of children. It meant potentially losing months of dangerous work and giving up her only chance to create systematic change. Through the grate, she watched as the enforcement squads raised their weapons. The targeting lasers converged on Hyun-Woo Keth's center, mass while smaller beams tracked the fleeing children. Ji-won's hand moved to the emergency beacon hidden in her clothing. One press would summon a Terran diplomatic rescue team, but it would also blow her cover completely and alert every hostile force in the sector to her presence. She thought of Captain Min-soo and the crew of the Harmony, who had risked everything to save dying Zephyrian warriors in the depths of space. She thought of the stories Hyun-Woo Keth had shared about human compassion transcending species boundaries. Sometimes, she realized, the most important choices weren't between right and wrong. Sometimes they were between good and better, between safety and heroism, between the mission and the moment, when a single act of courage could change everything. The enforcement squad's weapons reached full charge. Energy readings spiked on their displays as plasma conduits prepared to unleash lethal force. Ji-won pressed the beacon. Somewhere in the depths of space, automated systems received her emergency signal and began calculating hyperspace jump coordinates. Help was coming, but whether it would arrive in time remained to be seen. The red lights of the targeting systems painted deadly patterns across the corridor below as the final countdown began. The moment Ji-won activated her emergency beacon, everything changed on Kepler-7 station. The small device in her hand sent out a pulse that did more than just call for rescue. It transmitted her diplomatic codes, her mission parameters, and most importantly, terabytes of evidence she had been secretly gathering for weeks. But the beacon did something else entirely unexpected. Its signal awakened hidden communication devices that had been distributed throughout the refugee population by sympathetic traders and smugglers. Devices that Ji-won had never known existed, but which had been quietly building a network of hope in the darkest corners of the station. Within seconds, her distress call was being relayed through dozens of hidden transmitters. The message spread like wildfire through the refugee sections, carried by everything from modified medical scanners to repurposed cleaning drones that had been secretly reprogrammed by tech-savvy outcasts. In the corridor below, the enforcement squads were still preparing to fire when the first wave of refugees appeared. They came not as a mob, but as a river of determined beings flowing from every entrance, every maintenance shaft, every hidden passage in the lower levels. Jin-ho, a young Terran engineer who had been stranded on the station for months, led a group of human refugees carrying improvised shields made from cargo containers. Behind them came the Vortarian families, their children now safely positioned in the center of the group, protected by adults who had decided that some things were worth fighting for. The elderly cetacean, whose life Hyun-Woo Keth had saved, floated in her mobility tank, flanked by her podmates who had somehow acquired the station's emergency broadcast equipment. Her voice echoed through the corridors as she began transmitting everything that was happening directly to the Galactic Council chambers on distant Proxima Station. Citizens of the galaxy, Her translated words rang out through speakers throughout the station. Witness what happens when compassion is called weakness, when kindness is punished by death. The Corellian family that Hyunwoo Keth had helped register stood at the front of another group, their blue-gray skin now marked with ritual war paint. In their culture, witnessing an act of impossible generosity created a life debt that could only be repaid through absolute loyalty. They had brought weapons jury-rigged from mining equipment and cargo loaders, but the most surprising arrivals were the other security personnel. Not the enforcement squads loyal to Valdris, but the younger guards, the maintenance crews, and even some of the automated systems that had been quietly reprogrammed by sympathetic technicians. Minho, a Zephyrian junior enforcer, barely out of training, stepped between the execution squad and Hyunwoo Keth. His exoskeleton was smaller and less scarred than his elders, but his forearms held weapons that gleamed with fresh power cells. "Stand down, brothers," he said to the tactical team. "This warrior has shown us what our strength should be used for." The lead Chronosian enforcer snarled in frustration. "Move aside, youngling, you don't understand the contamination this one spreads." "I understand perfectly," Minho replied. "He shows us that protecting the weak makes us stronger, not weaker. That is truth worth fighting for." What happened next transformed from a potential massacre into something unprecedented in galactic history. Instead of violence, the refugees and their unexpected allies began a coordinated non-violent resistance that paralyzed the station's operations. Human engineers shut down the life support systems in the security sectors while maintaining full power to the refugee areas. Alien hackers seized control of the communication arrays and began broadcasting live footage of the standoff to news networks across the galaxy. Maintenance crews sealed off the upper levels, where Station Security Chief Valdris and his loyal enforcers were trapped. The Aquiline refugees, with their natural ability to move through the station's water recycling systems, emerged from unexpected locations to disable weapons caches and secure vital control points. Their bioluminescent skin created an eerie but beautiful light show as they moved through the corridors like living stars. Most remarkably, the station's automated defense systems began turning against their own controllers. Cleaning drones formed protective barriers around refugee families. Cargo-handling robots refused to respond to security commands. Even the artificial intelligence that controlled the station's basic functions seemed to have developed a conscience. "This is impossible," Valdris hissed over the communication system from his sealed command center. "Machines don't choose sides, they follow programming." "Maybe they learned something from watching organic beings choose compassion over cruelty," replied Kira, the elderly Nexarian whose empathic abilities had allowed her to interface with the station's computer systems in ways no one had thought possible. The siege lasted for 6 hours. During that time, the galaxy watched through live broadcasts as humans and aliens worked together to protect a single Zephyrian warrior who had dared to show kindness in a place designed for cruelty. Ships began arriving even before the official rescue fleet. Merchant vessels carrying medical supplies, cargo haulers loaded with food and equipment, even a few military vessels whose crews had been moved by what they were seeing. Captain Minsu of the merchant vessel, Harmony, was among the first to dock. The same Terran captain whose crew had saved Hyunwoo Keth years earlier stepped onto the station to find his former passenger now surrounded by beings from dozens of species, all willing to risk their lives to protect him. "It seems you learned our lessons well, old friend," Captain Minsu said as he embraced the massive Zephyrian. "And taught me new ones," Hyunwoo Keth replied, gesturing to the diverse crowd around them. "Kindness grows when planted in fertile ground." The transformation of Kepler-7 became the catalyst for changes that rippled across the galaxy. The evidence broadcast during the uprising led to investigations of refugee treatment on hundreds of stations and planets. New laws were passed establishing basic rights for displaced persons regardless of species or origin. 6 months later, the former trading post had been converted into the headquarters of the Interspecies Refugee Protection Network. The observation lounge where Ji-won and Hyunwoo Keth had first truly spoken now served as a memorial to the power of cross-species cooperation. Standing at that same viewport, watching as another convoy of aid ships approached the station, G1 marveled at how much had changed. The swirling nebula outside looked the same, but everything else was different. Where once there had been fear and desperation, now there was hope and purpose. "You taught me something important," she said to Hyun-woo Keth, who stood beside her, watching the ship's dock. His amber eyes reflected the light of distant stars as he turned to look at her. "What is that?" "Being human isn't about species," Ji-won replied, thinking of all the non-human beings who had risked everything to protect what they believed was right. "It's about choosing to care." Hyun-woo Keth's mandibles clicked in the sound she had learned to recognize as deep satisfaction. Then Galaxy is becoming more human every day. Outside, the newest ship in the convoy began extending its docking clamps. The vessel bore the insignia of the Galactic Medical Corps, but its crew included beings from every corner of known space. All of them united by a single simple idea that had started with one desperate refugee asking for a single credit, and one warrior choosing compassion over cruelty. The end.